Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Revi'i, Laws of Shabbos, Chapter 4. All the chapters in Hilchot Shabbat, the 30 chapters of the Rambam's Laws of Shabbos, are quite long on average. This one is the shortest of them all. It's just 6 halachot, and it's actually quite interesting that in Masechet Shabbat, in Mishnayot, which is also one of the longest tractates in all of Mishnayot, 24 chapters, the 4th chapter of Shabbat is also very short, one of the shortest in all of Shas, in all of the Mishnayos, just 2 Mishnayot. And the chapter 4 of Masechet Shabbat and chapter 4 of the Rambam's Hilchot Shabbat both address the same topic. And that's the topic that's here on the screen. It's called Hatmana. Yesterday, we began a lengthy discussion about doing melacha, doing forbidden labor on Friday, and having it go into Shabbat, when it's permitted, when it's forbidden. And a lot of the conversation revolved around cooking, leaving food that's somewhat in the middle of the cooking process on the fire throughout Shabbat. Everything we discussed in the last chapter was called shehiyah, literally leaving food on a fire. Today, the Rambam addresses another method of preserving heat of cooked foods, not through leaving it over a fire, but through what's called hatmana. Hatmana literally means burial or concealing, covering. We take certain materials that have the power to either preserve or increase heat, and you cover the pot with it so that the heat of the food is retained or even increased in some cases. And today the Rambam will discuss the parameters of when that's allowed and when that's forbidden. Essentially, there's going to be 4 issues discussed in this chapter. Number 1 is what's called davar hamosif hevel, things that increase heat. We're going to call them heat increasers. If you wrap a pot in this material, not only is the current heat going to stay at its level, it's going to increase. The second level is what's called davar she'eino mosif hevel, a wrap, a cover, which doesn't increase heat, it simply preserves it. But both of those are discussing hot food that's being wrapped in either a heat preserver or a heat increaser. Then the Rambam will discuss wrapping cold food in a preserver that may make it get a little bit hotter or at least not get colder. And finally, we have the last level, which is discussed in this chapter, which is where you don't even have any hatmana going on. You don't even have a concealment happening. You're simply conducting heat from something hot to something cold. And the Rambam will discuss when and under which conditions each of these cases is allowed. Let's begin halacha aleph. Yesh dvarim. There are certain materials. By the way, here you see on the screen, I guess more of a modern day hatmana. You have a kettle and it's covered in a material which insulates it, which preserves it. This is not exactly the hatmana the Rambam will discuss, but I just put it here for illustration purposes. Halacha aleph says the Rambam, yesh dvarim, there are certain things, she'im taman bahen tavshil, that if you were to cover a cooked dish with them, hu mitchamem, it will get heated, umosifin bebishulo ke'en ha'esh, and they increase the cooking just like fire does. Kigon, the Rambam gives us an example of 8 different materials. You can see them here on the screen, going from right to left, downwards. Hagefet, olive residue. When you squeeze olives to produce oil, what remains of the olives after the squeezing can actually be used in hatmana to cover a dish. V'zevel, animal manure, that's the second one. Melach is salt, thick salt. V'sid and lime. V'chol is sand, the bottom right there. O zagin, or grape skins. Umuchin, and unprocessed wool. V'asavim, and grasses. These last 3, bizman sheshloshtan lachim, as long as those 3 are moist and damp. V'afilu machmat atzman, even on their own account. You didn't pour water on them. They're wet because they're wet naturally. Those last 3, all of these 8 things are davar hamosif hevel. Dvarim elu nikra'in davar hamosif hevel. These things are called things which increase in heat. The yesh dvarim, there's another list of things, she'im taman bahen tavshil, that were you to cover a dish with them, yisha'er b'chamimuto bilvad, that would simply retain its heat. Ve'enan mosifin lo bishul ela mon'ino tomeli hitztanen. They don't add in any of the cooking stages, they just stop it from getting colder. Kigon, here the Rambam gives 10 examples, and they're here on the screen. Zagin, umuchin, v'asavim, yiveshin. He repeats the last 3 from the first list. Grape skins, unprocessed wool, and grass, but this time when they're dry. If you were to wrap a dish in these things when they're dry, they don't add any heat, they simply preserve it. Uksut, upeirot, v'kanfei yonah. Cloth, or fabric, right here. Peirot is produce, like grain. Kanfei yonah is bird feathers, pigeon feathers. Uneoret hapishtan, unesoret chorashim. Beaten flax. When you beat flax to get all the wood chips out of it, what you're left with is this kind of a thing. And then you have sawdust right there. Ushlachin v'gizei tzemer, and animal hides and shearings of wool. All of these things, dvarim elu nikrain davar she'eino mosif hevel. These are things which are called heat preservers because they don't add, they don't increase any of the heat. Halacha bet, the Rambam now addresses what's the law of wrapping a dish in these two materials. Min hadin haya, logic would dictate. The law should say, shetomnin bedavar hamosif hevel miba'od yom, that if you have something which increases the heat, just like when it comes to fire, you're allowed to leave a dish on the fire over Shabbos, and we don't say it's called cooking, you should be able to leave tomnin, you should be able to cover a dish in something which increases the heat while it's still day, and allow the dish to remain covered on Shabbat. You can literally leave a pot over the fire on Shabbos. Certainly you should be allowed to cover in a heat increaser. Says the Rambam, however, the sages prohibited us from covering a dish in something which increases the heat even while it's still day. Why? There's a decree. We're worried for the following scenario. Perhaps in the process of being covered, the heat is going to increase so much that the pot is going to boil over. And you're going to have to uncover the covering until the boiling recedes. And then you're going to go back and cover it again on Shabbos. Turning you into a case where you're actually covering a dish with something that increases the heat on Shabbos. That's certainly not allowed. Shehu asur. That's forbidden. And therefore the sages said, no covering in a heat increaser on Friday. However, there's a caveat to this. Because the whole concern is about boiling over, if the time frame where pots typically boil over passed, therefore says the Rambam, mutar lahatmin medavar hamosif hevel ben hashmashot. In the twilight zone, you're allowed to cover a dish with something which increases in heat. Because by default, pots that have been cooking on Friday, by the time twilight on Friday evening arrives, they've already boiled over and receded from their boiling. We have a rule that once the pot boils over, it's not going to boil over again. And therefore, in that zone of ben hashmashot, you actually could cover a dish with a heat increaser. What if you transgressed the prohibition of the sages and you covered a dish with a heat increaser during the day? So there's somewhat of an argument. In the Shulchan Aruch it says that it's forbidden till Motzei Shabbat. The same way in the last chapter we had, if you left something on the fire which you shouldn't have left, it's forbidden to partake till after Shabbat. Over here also it's forbidden. However, the Ramah says if you were inadvertent, if you didn't know about the prohibition, then you could eat it even on Shabbat. Halacha Gimel, now the Rambam addresses davar she'eino mosif hevel, things which don't increase the heat preserver. Just like there was a logical conclusion which the sages forbade when it came to davar hamosif hevel, the same thing applies to davar she'eino mosif hevel. V'chein min hadin haya. Also, logic should have been, legally, the case should have been that litmon hatavshil bedavar she'eino mosif hevel b'Shabbat atzma, that you should be allowed to cover a dish in something which doesn't increase the heat on Shabbos itself. After all, it's not cooking. You're not adding any heat. You're simply covering it and insulating it and preserving the heat. The sages forbade this as well. For fear of the decree, Shema yatmin beremetz. You might cover the dish in hot ash. That's a pile of hot ash right there. Hot ash could be just ash, harmless ash, in which case it's not mosif hevel. It doesn't increase any of the heat. But sometimes in a pile of hot ash, you have embers of glowing coals. We're worried that in this case there's going to be sparks, embers of fire, in which case, of course, the fire does increase the heat. And that will cause you to stir the coals, just like we had all the worry when it came to cooking, leaving a pot on a fire. The reason why it's forbidden is because you might stir the coals. Here also you might stir the ash, and of course, that's going to turn you into a real person that's cooking on Shabbos, which is forbidden. Therefore, if it's a hot dish, the sages forbade you from covering it, even in something which doesn't increase the heat. Rather, if you're doing Hatmana, the only way to do it, turns out according to this halacha, is to cover a dish before Shabbos in something which doesn't increase the heat and simply preserves it, and then you can keep it over Shabbos. When it's the time when you're in doubt whether it's nightfall or not, you're still allowed to chaparain then, cash in and cover the hot dishes that you have. But that's all for hot dishes. When it comes to cold dishes, if it's a cold dish, even if it's on Shabbos, you can cover it with something which doesn't increase the heat. Because as long as you're not increasing the heat, you're simply preserving. Here you're not preserving heat, so we don't have the worry of hot ash. You're simply preserving cold temperature. You're simply there not to let it get colder or to maybe undo a little bit of the coldness, maybe make it a little bit lukewarm. But no, you're not crossing the border to heat. And therefore, it's okay to cover things that are cold. If you have hot food that you covered on Erev Shabbat, legally, in a kosher way, and then it became uncovered on Shabbos, and the commentaries say even if you uncovered it purposely, for example, to serve your guests, mutar lechasotan. Since it was covered legally in a proper way before Shabbos, if it gets uncovered on Shabbos, you can cover it back. Shaharei no mosif, because again, you're dealing with things that are heat preservers, not heat increasers, and you're not doing anything which induces cooking. Umutar laha khalifa kisui b'Shabbat. Not only that, you're also allowed to change the covering on Shabbos. Ketza, what does that look like? Notel ksut umaniach kanfeona. You can take fabric and replace it with feathers. Or notel kanfeona umaniach ksut, or take the feathers and replace it with fabric. So long as it was covered in a legal way before Shabbos, you can adjust it on Shabbos as well. Halacha hey. Pinaha tavshilo hamayim hachamin mikli likli acher. Let's say you had covered the hot dish in a certain material before Shabbos. Then on Shabbos, you transferred the contents of the pot to another pot. Says the Rambam, mutar lahatmina kliya acher b'Shabbat b'davar she'eino mosif. Here, even though it's on Shabbos and you're covering a new dish, you can cover it anew with materials that are only heat preservers. In this case, we look at it as a cold object, even though when it comes to hot food, on Shabbat, we don't wrap it with something that doesn't increase the heat. But here, because you've transferred the contents from one pot to another, we're going to talk about this much later when it comes to the laws of cooking, the sages saw kli sheni, a secondary utensil, as having much less heat than the original one. Once you transfer the contents of the pot from the original pot to a new pot, now it's considered to be, for this context, cold food. The only thing which the sages forbade is to cover on Shabbos something hot which is in its original utensil, the pot in which it was cooked. But were you to empty it from one pot to another, then mutar, it is permitted to cover it. Halacha vav, now we address the fourth topic of the chapter, which is conducting heat not through covering the material, simply by putting one pot on top of another, one dish on top of another. Manichin mecham al gabe mecham b'Shabbat. You can place a metal pot on top of a metal pot on Shabbat. Ukdeira al gabe kdeira, an earthenware pot on top of an earthenware pot. Ukdeira al gabe mecham mecham al gabe kdeira. Earthenware on top of metal, metal on top of earthenware. Here you have an example of each. That would be a metal pot on the side there, and the earthenware pot that was very common in times of old. Betach pihen bebatzek, and you can even layer their mouths with dough. Lo bishvil sheyuchamu, ela bishvil sheyamdu al chumam. Not because you want to increase the heat, but because you want to preserve and have them stay at the level of heat that they are right now. Shelo asru ela lehatmin b'Shabbat, because the only prohibition was covering. On Shabbos, here you're not covering. Aval lehaniach klicham al gabe klicham kadei sheyu amdim b'chamim mutar, but to put one hot pot on top of another hot pot, just to preserve the heat, mutar is allowed. Aval ein manichin kli sheyesh bo davar tzonen al gabe klicham b'Shabbat. This mechanism of putting pots on top of another is only when they're both already hot. But if you have a vessel which has something cold in it, and you want to put that on top of a hot pot, that's not okay. To do it on Shabbos, sharei molich bochom b'Shabbat, because you're conducting heat onto it on Shabbos. I should add over here that, by the way, if something is completely dry, then it may be allowed to put on top of a hot pot even on Shabbat. For example, if you have a blech covering your stove and you have a hot pot on the blech, you can take a challah that's cold and you can heat it up by putting it on top of the pot, so long as the challah is completely dry. But if there's some liquid in it, which is the case discussed in the Rambam, and it's cold, you cannot conduct heat from the hot pot to the cold. But if you would have done this before Shabbat, put something cold on top of something hot before Shabbos came in, then mutar, that's permitted. In this case, we wouldn't look at it as though you're covering it in something which increases heat, even though that's the goal. The hot pot is supposed to increase heat in the cold pot. Why? Because it's not tomen. Again, you're not covering it. Since you're simply putting one on top of the other, the sage's prohibition doesn't apply in this case.